Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you all for joining our telecon to discuss the upcoming Boeing Starliner crew flight test to the International Space Station. I'm NASA's Leah Cheshire, and I'm joined today by Steve Stich, Manager of NASA's Commercial Crew Program, Joel Montalbano, Manager for the International Space Station Program, and Mark Nappi, Boeing's Vice President and Starliner Program Manager. After each participant provides opening remarks, we will transition to a question and answer session with those joining us on the phone line. Please press star 1 to raise your hand and ask a question, and star 2 to lower it if your question has been asked. I'm going to turn it over now for our opening remarks, and we will start out with Steve Stich.
Thank you very much, and thanks to all the reporters that have joined in today so that we could update you on our status for the NASA Boeing Starliner crewed flight test. You know, this flight is a very important flight for NASA. Joel and I talk about it a lot. Getting a second crew transportation capability for the space station is hugely important to us, and so we've been working really hard on that. You know, it's been a busy couple of months for the commercial crew program. In addition to all the prep work that we've been doing to get ready for the crewed flight test, you know, we launched the Crew 6 mission to the station on March the 2nd, and then we had the Crew 5 successful return recently on March 11th. The next big event for Crew 6 will be a port relocation that will be done to set us up for a cargo flight, which will fly in the June timeframe, which Joel will talk more about. You know, last week we talked about the crewed flight test moving after the Axiom 2 flight, and we've been spending a lot of time assessing the readiness for the crewed flight test. When we look across the vehicle, you know, the Starliner spacecraft is in really good shape. It's in the C3PF, largely ready for flight, getting the cargo loaded and some final closeouts of the crew cabin. And then, you know, the big activity next is really when to load propellant on the service module. The Atlas launch vehicle is ready for flight. It's been at the Cape for some time. In fact, just last week we had a launch vehicle readiness assessment that we did for that crewed flight test launch vehicle, and it's in really good shape. There really are no issues relative to the launch vehicle. We've been working really hard at trying to look at how all the different pieces of the flight align, and when we look at all the different pieces, most of the work will complete in April for the flight, but there's one area that's extending out into the May timeframe, and this really has to do with the certification products for the parachute system. And so when we've been meeting with Mark and Joel and looking at where to head with the date, trying to thread the needle behind the manifest at the Eastern Range and then the manifest considerations for ISS, we've deliberated and decided that the best launch attempt is no earlier than July 21st for CFT. And that's really, you know, letting the Axiom flight fly, and then Joel has an important cargo flight next. And then, you know, for the commercial crew program, our next handover for the crew will be Crew 6 to Crew 7 in the mid-August timeframe. And so when we look at how all those flights lay out, this late July timeframe, no earlier than 7/21, is the right time to go fly a Starliner. We know there's another launch in that same timeframe on the manifest today. We'll have to go work with other government agencies and United Launch Alliance to secure the slot, and we know that's forward work coming out of today, but we just wanted to sit down with you and explain where we're at relative to CFT and this no earlier than date. You know, in terms of big milestones, Butch and Sunny were in the spacecraft recently in something we call a crew equipment integrated test. It's really a checkout of the spacecraft. The Boeing team did an excellent job being ready for that test. And the crew went down, got in the spacecraft. They could see the actual configuration of the spacecraft where the cargo was, get in and check out the cabin, the reaches to various switches, and it was really a high-fidelity test of getting ready for flight, and that was an important milestone on the way to CFT. You know, where we're at right now is really getting through the certification work, and why is certification important? For the crewed flight test, this vehicle gets an interim human rating from NASA, and so we're in the middle of doing that work now, and it is a large amount of work which has been going on for well over a year. And if I just step back and look at how much work goes into that, there's 600 components that have to be qualified on the Starliner for NASA and Boeing to review jointly, over 70 hazard reports, and then a total of what we call 370 verifications. And those verifications some of those are really detailed. For example, The ones that still are remaining for us to work through are the aborts for Starliner. So Starliner has the capability to abort from the launch pad all the way into orbit. And so each of those regimes, we go through and look at the data that Boeing provides, the way the vehicle flies, and then we do an independent assessment on the NASA side of how the vehicle flies with an independent model. And so we're working through that. Additionally, we take a hard look at the parachute system, and that, as we talk a lot about the parachute system in all human spacecraft, and we go back and review all the data across all the parachute tests we've done. We've done over 20 parachute tests across the life of the program. We go review all that data, we review all the analysis to make sure that system's really ready to go fly. At this time, there's really no issues or concerns with the parachute system. The parachutes are installed in the vehicle. They're in good shape. It's just a matter of going through all that data and looking at the data and making sure we're really ready to go fly safely. We do have one additional ground test that we're going to go do on the parachute system, and this is a deployment of something called a forward heat shield parachute. And it is used to actually remove the cover off the very top of the Starliner spacecraft that then exposes the other parachute systems to deploy. And we're going to do a test at the highest possible regime that it could see in an abort part of the flight, and so we'll do that test on the ground, and just to make sure that system can deploy properly. It's a very important flight for us. The goal of this flight really is to test out the end-to-end system and get ready for the next flight, which is a PCM flight. While we're docked to ISS, we'll do a number of important tests with Butch and Sunny, testing the safe haven capability and also testing mobility and living in the spacecraft as we look forward to flying for crew very soon. So I thank you for joining us today again. It's an important mission for NASA and important to go forward. And I'll let Joel talk a little bit about some of the considerations on the International Space Station.
Thank you, Steve, and thank you, everybody, for joining us today. As Steve mentioned, we did have our joint control board yesterday between the Space Station program and the Commercial Crew program. We did baseline the July 21st date, and as Steve said, we'll have to work with the range to understand the conflicts there. We're looking forward to having Butch and Sunny on board. They will be docked to the International Space Station about 8 days, and in addition to the vehicle checkout that they will do with their spacecraft, we plan to use them in utilization and research activities on board the International Space Station, so they will join the crews that are already on board. Space Station, as you hear, we're always busy, always doing things. Just yesterday, we had the undock and landing of the 68 Soyuz. In a couple days, I guess tomorrow, we'll have on Thursday this week, we'll do a reboost with the Cygnus spacecraft. And so we're looking forward to doing and using that capability on board. That'll be in the morning Houston time, and just under a meter per second is our current plan. Fast forwarding, looking in early April, we have a Soyuz relocation of the 69 Soyuz that launched in February. We have a number of spacewalks scheduled in April as well. We have 2 Russian spacewalks, a U.S. spacewalk to do some IROSA preparation work for the third set of arrays, as well as retrieving some communication hardware that we want to return to Earth and refurbish. And then the Russians have another EVA in early May. Crew, SpaceX CRS-27, that mission's going well. We're looking at an undock April 15th of that mission. That'll be about 30 days on orbit for those guys, and that vehicle delivered over 6,000 pounds of investigations, crew supplies, and hardware. Looking ahead, we are continuing to work with our Roscosmos colleagues on the return of the Soyuz that launched in February of this year, and right now they're targeting a September 27th landing date. With that, Frank Rubio and the 2 cosmonauts will have spent 371 days, or Frank will spend 371 days on orbit. So we're looking forward to, that's a new record for an American, and so we're looking forward to seeing that. As Steve said, having 2 U.S. crew vehicles able to launch and deliver crew to the International Space Station is a huge goal of our programs, of the Agency of Human Spaceflight. So we're excited They have another capability. We're looking forward to this mission. And with that, let me hand it over to Mark.
All right. Good afternoon, and thanks for joining the call. Appreciate everyone's interest in CFT and Boeing Starliner. Last time we talked to you, we told you that we were marching towards an April launch date, and that work was on plan for that. Today we'll update you based on some of the things that Steve just said and where all the products are with respect to launch. First of all, great deal of progress has been made since then. We're very close. When we talked to you last, I told you that we tracked the program using 5 swim lanes or 5 areas. The hardware makes up the first 2 in building the service module, and then second, refurbishing the crew module, and then the last 3 are flight software, getting it ready to fly, mission operations, all the training that takes place, and the products that they need to produce, and then the engineering products. 4 of those swim lanes are essentially complete and on hold, waiting for what we call L- activities. Several days or X number of days before launch, you do the same thing for each mission. And since the launch is going to be moved out into that July timeframe, we're going to have a little bit of a gap here. So we'll set that date and then build those L- activities, and those 4 swim lanes will pick up work then. The 5th one, which is the engineering products, of course, is much more complex. The areas, most of the areas that needed to be complete are going to be complete by the end of April. And the one area that Steve talked about, which is the parachute VCN or verification closure notice, and the hazard report will poke out into May, and our teams will work together to get that complete. All the paperwork's been put together for that to take place. We feel very confident that there's a lot of review that has to be done of the artifacts and the report itself, which points to all the design analysis and testing that has been done. But we don't expect any surprises there. The teams have been working together for the last year to understand that information, and this is just now going through the final documentation. Very confident in our parachute system, and like I said, we've been in lockstep with NASA the whole way. Like Joel laid out, July is the best place for us to dock with the International Space Station, so we'll have quite a bit of margin in those other 4 swim lanes to get our work done, and we feel pretty confident with that date. From this point on, we'll build all our schedules and plans backwards from that launch date, and like I said, get those L- activities into each one of our swim lanes and be able to support that date. I'll talk a little bit more detail about each one of those swim lanes so I can give you an idea of how prepared we are. For the first one, the crew module and the service module, those are assembled now into the spacecraft. The final testing is all complete, and like Steve said, we did the crew equipment interface test, which we call CEIT. Talked with the crew after that test. They were very happy with what they saw, and they're feeling good about the configuration that the vehicle's in. Our next big test for that, or next big operation for the spacecraft, is to load propellant, and we'll do that about 40 days prior to the launch date. The flight software is complete. It's been loaded on the vehicle. All the testing and final revisions are done. We're currently doing some additional testing that is related to how the hardware and the flight software work as an integrated system. And that involves testing our backup systems, and then we have multiple failure scenarios where we fail different pieces of the system in order to see how the entire system reacts. So this gives the crew more training, more confidence. It stresses our systems so that we can make sure that we have a lot of confidence in our GNC and flight software. And we're going to finish the rest of that testing by the end of April. This testing is, again, a combination of the stress testing that we want to do, the additional training for our teams, And it also stems from a recent discovery we had with a black box, which we call an IPC, which is an integrated propulsion controller, where we found a logic error that needed to be fixed. We fixed that. That was pretty simple to go do with a minor mod to the vehicle. However, we want to make sure that that same condition doesn't exist anywhere else. So part of this testing is to validate that this was an isolated case. And in the mission operations area, we're still performing simulations, but most of their work is also tied to the LMANIS activities, so we'll build that plan to support the launch date. And, of course, their resources are all participating in all that confidence testing that I just talked about. The other engineering products are the drawings, the rest of the cert paper, and then closing all of the last missions, IFAs, et cetera. That is all either complete or it's just waiting to go to a board to get the final sign-off. So it's in good shape. So all of that work that I just talked about is related to CFT. We've also been working on PCM1, and that work is also progressing well. It's on plan it's on the plans that we've laid out, and there's quite a bit of margin that exists. We've gone down to one shift, so if we need to, we could extend the shifting and make up for any lost time if that was to happen. But right now, that's all on plan, and we'll be ready for that mission when it gets called up. Based on the timing that NASA decides on. There's a number of engineering issues and items that have been worked over the last several months. We've been working those in lockstep with NASA. We don't see any surprises, and we believe we're in pretty good shape. So, what do we do with the time between now and launch? We're always working to improve our systems, our operations, and our process. We'll take, the additional time to work these improvements. We'll start our LMANIS activities in each one of those swim lanes as the schedule requires us to. Our team's not in any hurry. We know that what we're doing is extremely important, launching humans in space and providing NASA with this second provider. So we'll take our time and we'll make sure that everybody's confident with the work that's been done. We're very proud of the team, the work that's been done, and we understand how significant this mission is for both us and NASA, and we'll be ready to fly when the ISS can accept us and we've got all this work behind us. And I'll turn it back over to Leah.
Thank you very much, and thank you all again for your opening remarks with those updates. We're now going to move into the question and answer portion of the telecon today. A reminder to raise your hand by pressing *1 if you have a question, and by pressing *2 to lower it if your question has been asked by someone else. Another reminder, please state your name and affiliation and to whom your question is directed, and please limit yourself to one question. We'll start out with Eric Berger.
Sorry, hi. Thanks very much for doing this. Two questions. First of all, for Steve Stich, I was wondering if maybe you could go on and talk a little bit about some of the paperwork and certification issues that caused you to delay the flight. I think that maybe there have been some issues with some waivers that you just weren't able to clear. And then for Joel, Soyuz MS-22 returned yesterday. There were some reports about the internal temperature being 50 C or higher. And I'm just wondering, from a human health performance, if Sergei, Dmitry, and Frank had been on board, do you guys think it would have been fatal for them? Thanks.
Okay, Eric, this is Steve. I'll take the first question and then let Joel talk about the second one. I would say there's no real issues that we've encountered in getting through the certification products. It's just a matter of going through all the data and doing the independent analysis that we do, primarily in the trajectory area and also in the parachute margins area, just to make sure. We like to double check everything within the space program, right? There's always a primary analysis and a backup analysis. And so, for example, just to give you the thoroughness for the abort regime, we have a requirement that says take the whole trajectory from launch to when you get into orbit, break it up into 10-second bends, and we say you have to have a 95% success rate in each of those bins. And so we're really going through all that data and evaluating each one of those from the pad aboard all the way through ascent to make sure that each one of those is okay, do an extra analysis. And the thing is, it's a really complicated set of analysis for the GNC performance. Can the vehicle handle the loads after the vehicle separates from the launch vehicle and then deploys the parachutes and lands? And so we're just working through each one of those. On the parachute VCN and hazard report that Mark mentioned, that parachute hazard report is divided into 33 sections, and they range from how the parachutes are manufactured, how they're assembled, how they were tested, the video analysis of all that testing, the loads margins, and we're just in the process of kind of going through all that data one time before we go say that the vehicle has an interim human rating, which is required for the flight. We only have a handful of waivers to get through the system. I would say none of those are really big ones. I think we're down to maybe 4 type waivers that we have to get through. So.
And let's see on the temperatures, and we really want to keep today focused on CFT, but we did hear the report of the 50 degrees Celsius. That is not what the technical teams here were chasing down, so we have a number of questions we have open with our Russian colleagues to better understand that. As far as future, we have our questions. We'll work with Mission Control Center Moscow and Roscosmos to better understand what happened, and I can tell you that until we understand that, that's when we'll decide as a joint team between NASA and Roscosmos to return crew members if there were to have a problem. Now, I can tell you that the current Soyuz up there is operating nominally. We're not having any issues with the thermal control system. And so we did hear, again, the same thing you heard yesterday, and we're chasing that down.
Thank you both. And our next question is from Lenka White.
Thank you very much. My name is Lenka White. I'm from Sputnik News. To Mr. Joel, everything seems to go well so far, and assuming this will continue, how will the post-certification with Boeing Starliner influence the number of flights you have with SpaceX and the number of cross flights you have with Roscosmos, also given the current problems and yesterday's temperature, I guess? And to Mr. Stich, you mentioned that there is a lot of work around the certification. How does it differ from the certification you had to go through with SpaceX? Thank you.
Yeah. I'll start. This is Steve Stich with the certification. We essentially go through the exact same certification set of requirements between Starliner and Dragon. They have the exact same documents that govern those. There's 330 requirements that have to be bought off or certified. Same number of hazard reports for each of the systems broken down that we have to go through. And then relative to, I mentioned the details of the abort system certification. We went through the exact same process with Dragon, same process with the parachute system. So very much the same system. Relative to our CCP plan, addressing the first part of the question, relative to when we get Starliner certified, our intent in the commercial crew program would be to do one flight a year in CCP, one Boeing flight and then one SpaceX flight. So we would transition down to one for each. And we want both Boeing and SpaceX to be available to execute those flights, and getting Boeing certified is extremely important to us.
And in addition to the one SpaceX and one Boeing flight, the long-term plan is to continue having 2 Soyuz flights every year. And our long-term plan also is to have integrated crews on these vehicles. And so that's some forward work ahead of us. And but again, the short answer is one Boeing, one SpaceX, and 2 Soyuz flights every year.
Thank you.
Our next question is from Jim Siegel.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for taking my question. I'm with NASATech.net, and I have a question about the cargo and investigations that are being planned for this CFT flight. Specifically, what investigations, if any, are planned to be loaded and transported to the ISS on that flight? Thank you.
You know, we're still looking up the exact investigations that'll be flown on the flight, and so the teams are working those details. I can get that to you after the telecon. I don't have that in front of me, but you know, there's again the big objective of this flight is it's a test flight, right? And Steve and Mark can talk a little more. We want to test the capabilities of the vehicle. We want to bring, you know, we had the uncrewed vehicle to ISS. Now we want to bring a crewed vehicle, test out the interfaces again, see what we can learn on this vehicle. Our goal is to get the long-duration missions with the Boeing Starliner, and so that's really the focus. The science that we can fly on this vehicle will not be a lot, just because, again, that's not the focus of this flight, but we'll get you a list of what activities that we'll have the crew scheduled to do.
Thank you.
And some of the items we'll do while we're docked, as I mentioned, you know, we have a requirement on our crewed vehicles to do what we call a safe haven. And so basically we can use the vehicle as a temporary, certainly it's a lifeboat to return the crew at any point that it needs to. It can be powered up quickly and used as a lifeboat. But also, should ISS, the International Space Station Program, need us to go over in a Starliner, for a brief period of time, we can close the hatch and use the consumables and power and the life support systems of Starliner. So we'll go do that demonstration. That's one of them that we'll do. And then we'll also assess mobility and habitability while docked as we think about getting to the 4-person configuration as well. Sonny and Butch will get in the spacecraft and do some evaluations of the ability to work inside Starliner with 4 people based on their extensive experience.
Thank you.
Our next question is from Bill Harwood.
Hey, thanks. I think this is for Steve. You mentioned in the other flights that you're having to kind of work this in with, a Crew Dragon flight, a cargo flight, and you mentioned another activity with other agencies you'd be talking to. Can you tell us what the linkage is there? I mean, I'm assuming that's a DoD flight, but can you give us some sense of you know, how that plays into your July 21 date? Thanks.
Yeah, there's another mission on the range, another ULA mission in that time frame on the range, and we'll just have to go work with the Space Force and ULA to see, you know, the readiness of our vehicle, readiness of their vehicle, and whether we get that slot. It uses the same launch pad. It's an Atlas flight off of Pad 41. And so that's really the constraint, and it takes a number of weeks to start stacking in between for the flights. And there's also an important Vulcan test flight coming up, and that's going to happen in the May time frame that we're watching very carefully as well.
Our next question is from Jeff Faust.
Hi, Jeff Faust of Space News. Question probably for Steve or Mark. I'm just trying to understand what happened between the briefing we had in February when it looked like everything was, you know, proceeding smoothly to a launch in the latter half of April to now when we're looking at a July launch. Was it simply the work was taking longer than expected? Were there specific issues that came up? Just trying to understand what's causing what appears to be a fairly significant shift in the schedule. Thanks.
Yeah, this is Mark. I'll take that. You know, when my opening comments and talked about the 5 swim lanes, you know, 4 of those swim lanes were going to be complete by the end of April, and then the one that we have poked out is this one piece of the engineering certification. I think there's really no issues, like Steve had said, with that product. It's really more, it's taking longer than expected. It took longer for us to get the product over to NASA, and it's taken a little bit longer for NASA to review it with us. So that's really the reason for the poke out. And then once we get to the end of May, we start running into the traffic on ISS, which is, you know, contributes to the rest of the delay. So that's really the critical path to getting to CFT was those 2 things.
And then I think Mark also talked about the additional software testing for the backup system that's on Starliner that we really wanted to go execute. And I think that system is really important for this crewed vehicle. The system is Starliner is very robust in the sense that if all the flight computers were to fail, there's a system that the crew can use to fly the vehicle home essentially in a manual mode. And it's a great capability of the vehicle, and in particular needed for a precision landing on a runway or a geographical area like we have for Starliner. So we want to do some extra testing of that, as Mark said, just to make sure that it's a robust system. It's very complex the way it interfaces with the flight computers.
Our next question is from Mark Carreau.
Thank you. I just would like to know for sure how long you plan this flight, and again, how many days at the space station, and would you have any options to extend if you wanted? And also just to make sure that White Sands is still the return site. And I believe there was some previous agreements between Boeing and NASA to use some space in Mission Control Houston for the flight control. I wonder if that's, maybe I'm too long on that memory, but just where that function will take place. Thank you.
I can start off, and then Joel and Steve can weigh in. The initial mission was planned for 8 days. We have that baselined. Steve and Joel both said if there's more things that we can do that extend that a little bit, we certainly can. So we're off looking at that with our mission ops team to determine whether or not there's things that we would like to go do to take a little bit more time. So I think there's a TBD on whether or not the mission goes longer than 8 days.
Yeah, I would say, yeah, we're looking at when we laid out the timeline, 8 days is the minimum, and then, if we need extra time to go do some of these objectives that I talked about, if we want to spend a little bit more time with the Safe Haven demo, or we see something. One of the benefits of staying for a longer period of time is to watch the vehicle thermally and how ISS, as it provides both air and power, performs, and so we can take a little extra time. I think your other questions had to do with prime landing site. It's still the White Sands Space Harbor. And then the other thing is the flight control team is a NASA team that works under contract to Boeing to execute the flight. They've done a great job on the previous 2 flights, and they'll do the same thing on the crew flight test.
And I'll just add, there's no sharp cutoff after 8 days. If they need to stay a little longer, that's not an issue. We have that port available for until, I'll say, probably mid-August or so, when we have to do the crew rotation flight.
What's the duration of the flight overall, launch to landing?
I think we've put 8 days out as the minimum, and then we can adjust that as required. But 8 days is the minimum. So.
Okay, our next question is from Joey Roulette.
Thanks. Question for Steve Stich. What are the 4 waivers on the table that you guys are looking at? And for Joel Montalbano, you said the potential 50-degree Celsius number on MS-22 wasn't what your team was chasing down. Can you go a little bit more into what your team was chasing down, what you guys were looking for, and do you have any data on the capsule's return conditions? And if so, what are they? And when do you expect to hear back from the Russians on what you want? Thanks.
Yeah, let's see. I don't have all 4 waivers in front of me, but I know one of them has to do with a parachute was packed more than one time during the parachute packing, and so there's a waiver associated with that. The other one has to do with some seals in the launch port engine system, how many seals that you have relative to in the prop system, which is it's a typical kind of thing. Those are the 2 ones that I can remember off the top of my head, and the other ones, we processed a number of them. They didn't stand out to me as being really substantial overall. We'll see when we get through the aborts if whether there's, we actually, when we wrote that requirement, I would say back even 10 years ago, we anticipated that the 95% availability of meeting the abort criteria in each one of these 10-second bends would be very, very tough. One of the things that I really like about the vehicles we have, both Starliner and Dragon, is their abort capability is really greatly improved compared to space shuttle. If you step back and think about the space shuttle, we had intact abort capability for a single engine failure, and that vehicle had to fly on the remaining engines and get to a runway. Well, these vehicles, can really escape from a rocket that has a major problem in flight or at the launch pad. And so, real testament to safety with both what Boeing has done with Starliner and the testing they've done on the engines. So.
And let's see, on temperatures and performance of the vehicle, I expect we'll need probably a couple weeks, 2 to 3 weeks, working with the folks at Mission Control Center Moscow and Roscosmos to make sure we understand the data. We did see different temperatures, and my preference is not to throw out another number and add confusion, but just give us a couple, 2-3 weeks or so, and if you'd like, we can have another media telecon, possibly joint with Roscosmos, and we can report further. Just, again, first data, anytime you do a major dynamic activity, you want to take some time and make sure you understand what you're seeing.
Thanks. And for Mark, Nappi, are you able to say what those 2 other waivers are? Thanks.
No, Steve and I rely on our teams to work through these. It's not like they just drop these waivers on us and they don't talk. They work these and agree on them before they even come to us. So once they agree, we get really comfortable with the list, and the final board approval is really less of an event because the teams have already technically agreed on everything. So I don't recall what the other 2 are.
I did remember one of them. One of them has to do with the way the aborts are executed in close to station. So, as the vehicle flies in and docks to station, the crew can back away from station and come back again if either the vehicle were to have a systems problem or station had a problem. And one of those has to do with the requirements were set up for all the aborts to be automated, and Boeing has chosen, and it's going to be acceptable to use manual capability in some of those cases. And this vehicle is well set up for a crew to fly. Has great capability for flying during all phases of flight, except for ascent, of course, which we didn't fly the space shuttle just because the loads environment is such that it's really not the right time to fly. But for all other phases of flight, the vehicle is well set up for a crew to fly it.
Next question is from David Curley.
Thanks very much. Steve Stich, you told us in February that there were some changes in the parachute system which were basically like changing the size of the bolt. And now we're hearing about we need another ground test on releasing the heat shield. So is this delay paperwork, or is it NASA needs additional proof that the system will work as expected?
Yeah, the change. So let's just step back on the parachute system. So the change we talked about was for the next flight, PCM1. There's a joint that's been upgraded to essentially provide a little more strength for that one joint. So that'll be on the PCM1. So that's on the main canopy. The test we're talking about is one last test to prove that, and we do not think there's any particular issues, but to get the full range of what's required from a verification and validation, one additional test to ensure that the forward heat shield parachute, so there's the way the system works is the first thing on the whole parachute deploy is at the right altitude, there's a trigger and 2 mortars fire essentially through the structure and fire out 2 small forward heat shield parachutes, and those are used as some nuts fire to pull the cover off of Starliners to expose the drogues and then the main parachutes. And so we want to do one more ground test of that deployment system just to make sure that the highest possible flight regime airspeed that it could be deployed at, that it would work properly. And we don't anticipate any problems, but it's really just closing out. Essentially, if you think about a matrix of all the different points that you want to close out, imagine at the far end of this test point, we use the OFT2 data, we use the pad abort data, and then for one of the abort regimes, we want to get one more test point based on this ground test.
But are you talking about, because Mark Nappi talked about paperwork, or is it the test? I mean, which of these, or both, are forcing this delay?
Yeah, I would say the test looks like it will fit in the time frame. That test should happen in the May time frame as well. So the test is in May, and then the paperwork. And when we always use the word paperwork, I don't necessarily like that term because it really is certification of the vehicle. And so it is really all the analysis that says because you can only do a limited number of tests, then you build a model based on those tests, and those models tell you that the parachute system can perform over a wide range of entry conditions. And so it's really going through all that data, and the modeling of the parachute system is kind of at the end of May, and this parachute test, which again is not a main canopy, it is the parachute that pulls off the forward heat shield that will happen also in the May time frame.
Thank you.
Next up is Ken Kramer.
Hi, thank you for doing this and taking my question. I want to follow up on the 50-degree temperature, please. If it really was 50, it's been asked before, would it have been survivable at all? And I think your analysis had been that it would reach, or Russ Cosmo's analysis had been that it would have been 40. So was that an incorrect analysis? Thanks.
So, Ken, a couple things. It's a combination of temperature and humidity. Where was this temperature measured? Was the temperature on the central computer? Was the temperature inside the capsule? There's so many questions on this that kind of trying to speculate isn't going to help anything. So I just request if you just give us a couple weeks, I promise we'll get back. And I know you guys will keep us honest and ask for a media telecon, but we'll do it again. Let us just get some data, and so we give you the right amount of data. And then at that time, I could even have one of our surgeons join us, and they can talk a little bit about temperatures as well and humidity. But it's a combination of temperatures and humidity.
Thanks.
Next question is from Michael Sheets.
Hi, everybody. I believe this question is most appropriate for Steve, but I guess I'm struggling to understand a little bit of why this mission was scheduled up until up until now for about a month from now, and yet we're only hearing now that it's delaying by 4 months. That's quite a large segment of time to only be finding out about a month before launch date. So is it these other certification processes that weren't expected? It seems like a lot of what we've been talking about today are all very known issues that would have arisen weeks, if not months earlier. Thanks.
Yeah, that's a fair question. I think we were scheduled for mid-April, and so we're talking about kind of a 3-month move here in the launch date, but there were a number of factors that went into that. I mean, I think if we would have looked at the space station manifest, we could have possibly flown earlier in the calendar time frame, but when we looked at what had to be flown for the station manifest, in particular the CRS-28 mission, we jointly decided that we would take the extra time and move this flight jointly between Joel, myself, and Mark. We'd move it to 7/21. I do think it was a big effort thinking back to Demo 2 and Dragon, getting through these certification products when we went through that effort. And it's always a little bit, as Mark said, some of the data came across a little bit late to us, and now it's the joint teams working through all that data and reviewing the data, and then getting into the right time frame to go fly. We want to make sure the engineers have the time to go through the data at the right level and review all the data and complete it. Perhaps we were a little optimistic on those reviews of those products in setting the April time frame. We knew April was a good time to go fly relative to Joel's manifest, and so what we've been trying to do is find the right windows and line them up with where we think we're going to be ready. There was kind of an April window. We looked at one point at a May window, and then we said, well, the May window doesn't work very well. Joel would have had to juggle his manifest around. That doesn't seem smart to do. And so when we kind of laid out all the flights and the importance of the flights, we came to the conclusion that the July window would be best. And also, it would give our team a little bit more time to check out this backup system that I talked about. And Mark said with introducing various failures in that testing to make sure that we really wrung out the system for crewed flight. As Mark said, there was a bug that was caught or a part of the software that wasn't quite working properly. We fixed that, and now we want to go look at the whole system just to make sure we're really ready to go fly. The vehicle is a very complicated avionics system, and we want to make sure that it's going to perform in all the flight regimes, including the backup mode that we would need to fly.
Okay, and our next question is from Micah Maidenberg.
Hey there. Steve, in February, you talked a bit about some of the perceptions of risk regarding the battery system on Starliner. Could you just walk through sort of the status of that analysis? And, did you end up accepting more risk, assuming it's resolved, related to that system relative to any earlier baselines? And then Steve or Mark, is there a cost estimate, or do you know the cost of the additional parachute test? Does that just get kind of added on to the existing contract? Thanks.
Yeah, I don't have the cost of that additional test with me today, so we just jointly baseline the test, and we'll go work that between our joint NASA and Boeing teams, like we have been doing for parachutes all along. In terms of the battery, we did get through that at the Joint Space Station Control Board, Program Control Board, and a number of weeks ago. I would say we're not accepting any additional risk for the flight. We took our time to go look at the worst case, and so, of course, everything we do in space flight has to do with the worst case, and so if we were to have a cell overheat in the battery, could that then overheat other cells, and how would the battery perform? And we convinced ourselves that we were in a good, acceptable posture to go fly the crew flight test, and I know Mark and his team are looking at some potential other mitigations for a PCM-1. Everybody at the board polled that they were going to proceed, the crew office, the engineering team, safety and mission assurance, and our program teams. We had a little bit better data than we had a few months earlier in terms of some testing and analysis that in these worst case scenarios that showed us that the cells would perform fine, and then even if they did have one of the cells overheat, that it would be acceptable in flight. We haven't seen any cells overheat on the vehicle. We haven't seen any of the cells that we have in any assembled batteries overheat. This is just a abundance of caution. You can read about cells in a laptop or an iPhone overheating in the media reports. And so our cells are screened differently. Our cells have more screening than a typical cell that's used in a commercial product like a laptop or an iPhone. And so we did clear that issue, and we felt like we're good to go fly.
Okay. Those are all the questions that we have for today, so we are going to wrap it up. Again, thank you to all of our participants who dialed in, as well as Steve, Joel, and Mark for joining us with those updates. You can always visit nasa.gov for the latest updates and blogs.nasa.gov/spacestation. Thank you again.